The one thing that stands out for me over and over again is that we're more similar than we are different. I think the more senior you get, that's more simple it gets, really. There's lots of different approaches and sciences and theoretical frameworks, and I now can kind of see how they overlap.
Today we're speaking to clinical psychologist and peak performance specialist Sarah Anticich. She has over 2 decades of experience in clinical psychology, both on the complex trauma side as well as the corporate side, and has found that the one thing we have in common is that we're all human.
It's the same science, it's the same needs, it's the same factors that drive uncertainty and anxiety and worry.
Today, we're diving into peak performance. What does that actually mean? How do we actually regulate and maintain this crazy lifestyle that is the reality of a female founder?
And there's a model by a man called Paul Gilbert, who's an expert in the area of self-compassion therapy, and he talks about these 3 bubbles. He talks about
and how can we navigate all the balls we're juggling in our life more effectively and, more importantly, more compassionately.
If you're aware, then you can regulate. So
Exactly.
you can't regulate something you're not aware of. It's hard to know what you need.
She shares practical tips and tricks and practices we can all apply today to really make a difference in our day-to-day life. I am so excited to welcome to the Powerhouse Diaries, Sarah Anticich. Welcome to the Powerhouse Diaries, the podcast for and by brave, bold, and badass business owners. If you're an entrepreneur who has outgrown those cookie-cutter business strategies and hashtag girl boss cliches, you're in the right place. Because let's face it, entrepreneurship is at least equal parts messy buns and runny mascara as it is the highlight reel we see online. So let's get real about what it really takes to build and run a quote-unquote successful business, blood, sweat, and margaritas included. I'm your host, Yaela, your rebellious entrepreneurial fairy godmother, and join me as I sit down with rockstar female founders for the most juicy, deep, and meaningfuls around success, life, and everything in between. Now it's time for you to step into your powerhouse era. Sarah, welcome. I am so excited to have you here. We are talking all things peak performance and just in general, like clinical psychology. Tell me, because this fascinates me. I know you've had background both in like complex trauma as well as in the corporate world. What's the overlap?
What's the overlap? It's a very good question. I think the more I learn and the more I work with different people, so I've had the privilege of working in the clinical space and in organisational wellbeing, and with lawyers, with real estate agents, with accountants, with lots and lots of different fields, as well as working in education, corrections, trauma, and I think the one thing that stands out for me over and over again is that we're more similar than we are different, and the drive, the unique human capacity to form and maintain relationships is what is pivotal to everything. And so I think what stands out, what's the overlap, is that we're human. And so whether I'm working with a mum with a newborn or a CEO in an organisation, it's the same science, it's the same needs, it's the same factors that drive uncertainty and anxiety and worry. So the overlap is that we're human and that we have this relational need to be safe and to feel good and to perform at our best.
It's so funny you say that because it sounds, like so stupidly simple. Of course, we're all human. But my experience with working with female founders and my personal experience is that a lot of us walk around feeling so alone and feeling like no one gets it. And what I'm hearing you say is whether you're working, in a correctional facility, basically, or with top performing founders and CEOs, the core wants, needs, desires, fears are the same.
For sure. And it's taken me quite a long time to assimilate lots of different theories to kind of explain that. I've been working as a psychologist for about 18, 19 years. And studied for 15 before that. So spent a lot of time thinking about humans and thinking about theories. And I think the more senior you get, the more simple it gets, really. And that there's lots of different approaches and sciences and theoretical frameworks, and I now can kind of see how they overlap and have come out the other side to be able to kind of present that to people in a really simple way, that actually it is simple. We tend to complicate things, and we break things down. As psychologists, we use a process called a clinical formulation, which is basically applying a theoretical approach to explain why someone presents the way they do, and then out of that we develop a bit of a plan. Okay, so what do we do about that? And so I kind of apply that process as I go along now quite naturally, and that allows you to figure out, what are the causal mechanisms contributing to where this person's at, and then what do we do about that? And 9 times out of 10, it's very simple, basic needs that aren't being met, in whatever context they may be in.
It's funny how it's so primal, really, for all of us. But tell me a little bit about what that was like. Having all this, I'm a big proponent, awareness, having that awareness of what is causing that precedes choice. When you're aware of something, you can move powerfully in the world. And maybe an assumption, but is there also a point where such understanding of what underpins certain behaviors becomes almost like a hindrance in your own life? Like you're walking around analyzing every kind of move you make?
Yes, probably. And as an overthinker and a perfectionist and someone that likes to do things properly, I think that overthinking and that urge to analyze everything and have a reason and be able to explain everything can be helpful and also not so helpful at times. So certainly what I've learnt, and I say to all my clients and everyone that I work with, is that everything that I'm suggesting, whether it be a grounding technique or a mindfulness technique or a reframe, cognitive reframe, I do myself. So, there's lots of things that I do every single day across the different realms of my life to manage maybe chaos, I'm not sure, but manage lots of different things that I do, juggling competing demands, and that requires me to use every tool that I've got, and particularly in the last few years with young people and businesses and work and lots of change, I've certainly had to apply the strategies and tools that I espouse to others, and I think that makes it more genuine, and that you get a better kind of understanding of self in order to be able to help others, really.
Yeah, you really walk the talk.
100%. Yeah, I try to. I don't know. My children might say sometimes that that's not the case, but I do try. Yeah.
So what are those things? If you're saying like the chaos, the organized chaos, or the attempted organized chaos, what are like the key foundational non-negotiables for you that help you perform at the Olympic level that you do?
What are the things? Having good people. Good crew. So I have very close family. I have amazing friends, and I intentionally connect with them a lot. So that's probably the number one. It comes back to that relational engagement. I think having good people on your bus. And the second thing, probably, and something that I've had to learn very intentionally, is to be where your feet are. So be in the moment. It's actually tattooed on my arm. Be where your feet are. That my capacity to worry and to think and to analyse and want things to be a certain way can take you offline. So I think compartmentalising and being where my feet are, and I think as a psychologist, we often work in kind of 50-minute lots. And so that kind of allows me to be very intentional in that moment and be present with the person in front of me, because it's often working with people that maybe are hypervigilant or may struggle with trust, and so the way I show up and being present and attuned to them is incredibly important. Yeah. So
to both of you,
to both of us, yes. And I have an amazing clinical supervisor who has helped me to be very intentional about where I am and what I'm doing in that moment, and I've tried to apply that to my home life. So when I get home, if I'm not ready to get out of the car, then I'll drive around the block again or sit in the car for a moment and be quite intentional about that shift from work to home life. And equally, if I'm going from kind of a clinical space to more of an organisational space, which can happen in the day, again, what's my intention, and that awareness of internal state. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What do I need in this moment in order to be able to show up? the best version of me given whatever the day is.
Yeah. Well, and I think that actually is such an important statement because, you know, we're talking peak performance and kind of navigating that space. And there is something about maybe it's the wording. I'm a stickler for words, but there's something about the concept of peak performance that has the rebel in me like push back. I'm like, I don't want to be like at my peak all the time. Like that is not a state I desire to be in. I think that's probably something that a lot of people who've experienced, whether it's burnout or anything related to that, or just recovering workaholics, kind of have a sensitivity towards because we know ourselves and our tendencies to overthink and overdo and not shut off. So I love that. Be very intentional, be very present, be where your feet are. Tattoo it on your arm, guys. But easier said than done.
Yes.
How do you do that?
There's a model. Again, I quite like models because
I love me a good model.
By a man called Paul Gilbert, who's an expert in the area of self-compassion therapy, and he talks about these three bubbles. And again, I quite like things to be visual because that makes life easier. But he talks about the threat and drive and a soothe system. So our threat system is our fight-flight response, where we feel anxious or worried. And if you think survival, hunter gatherer, we're out, fighting for our life and being able to protect ourselves. So that's a really important space to be at times, and is obviously important for survival. Then we have the drive system, which is more kind of the doing system, where we're pursuing things beyond ourselves. That's where we might be working or achieving or focusing. And then the soothe system is represented by a parasympathetic nervous system, which is kind of the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. Yeah. And what we see a lot, and I think particularly the concept of kind of high performance, is we confuse peak performance or high performance with performing at our best. And that threat drive bounce where you do it, and I kind of came to this because I experienced this. I could sit and drive all day, every day, particularly in the world of psychology because I love it and people. But in the absence of soothe, what can happen is we get in that that threat drive bounce, which is basically the recipe for burnout. So in the absence of down regulating or activating that soothe system, our parasympathetic nervous system, where we sleep and connect and rest and digest, we can end up burnt out. Yeah. And once we're there, it's very difficult to get out of it. And the reason for that is our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for most of our executive functions, which are higher order, kind of complex skills, which are responsible really for us being an adult, planning and time management and
overrated, guys.
Inhibition and self-regulation. So they're all quite important day to day.
It's helpful.
Yeah. But if our lid's flipped and our thinking brain is offline, and we're in that threat drive, then our ability to even be aware of ourself, our internal state, what am I thinking, what am I feeling, what do I need, is actually offline. And so what that means is not only are we doing too much, working too much, or doing things that might make us feel good, so it might not feel bad, but actually our body and our mind can't sustain that level of doing for too long in the absence of soothe. So I think it's really important, and I every 24 hours, actually probably more than 24 hours, but think, which bubble am I in and which bubble do I need to be in this moment, and that allows a little bit for a bit more balance. And I don't know if balance is possible in 2025, but it's certainly
intention,
allows, if you're aware, then you can regulate. So you can't regulate something you're not aware of. So if you don't know which bubble you're in, then it's hard to know what you need. And so that's probably one simple thing that I do amongst my chaos.
So like decide on which bubble you're in. It's such the more I learn in my work as a coach and just as a human, I guess, the more I don't understand how we are not taught nervous system regulation. Like it all comes down to that. Not having the tools or knowing how to down or up regulate, but not having the awareness that to check in with ourselves. I think if you would have told me that a few years ago, even 3-4 years ago, like, okay, check which bubble you're in. I don't know. I've never actually stopped to feel, to listen.
Yeah.
So for people who are listening and thinking, yes, this makes sense, it resonates on some level, but it sounds foreign.
Yeah.
What are symptoms, almost like markers they can look out for to indicate which bubble they're in?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think to answer that question in a kind of roundabout way is we talk about this concept of an internal mirror. So this comes from Berkeley's model around executive functioning, which people with ADHD might be familiar with, or cognitive behavioral theory or therapy. So awareness of internal state. So what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What cues is my body giving me? And so most of us look in an external mirror, our appearance at some point in the day. If we're checking our internal mirror at some point in our day, and I quite like the concept of micro steps, which comes from Ariana Huffington. I think she's amazing. But 30 seconds a day, too small to fail. So what's one thing that you do every single day? So I make a cup of coffee, check your internal mirror. Put your seatbelt on in the car, check your internal mirror. So what am I thinking?
Set an anchor in your day,
Absolutely.
like something you do every day that reminds you, this is my internal check.
Correct, yep. And then it kind of sets you up to be more aware. So what am I thinking? Well, I'm thinking that I've got a lot on today and I'm never going to be able to achieve everything, and that may well be valid given the demands that many of us are under. But being able to respond in a more self-compassionate way, I'm doing the best that I can. What's next? And just kind of breaking things down can help you be aware of what you're thinking and feeling, and then you can take intentional action and choice. So rather than being in your head the whole drive to work, you might be able to listen to your favourite song, or you might be able to call your friend.
Your favourite podcast.
Well, yeah, podcast. So I think to answer the question, which bubble am I in, we need to kind of stop and pause in our day. And visual reminders are quite useful, a bright pink sticky dot in the middle of our steering wheel, or something on a mirror, or
even alarms. I've set like little alarms in my phone a couple of times a day.
Yeah, for sure. And so 30 seconds a day, if we start doing that, just once a day, and I'm sure most of us can, give 30 seconds.
Yeah.
It kind of sets you up to get on that upward cycle of kind of positive emotion and hope and optimism, rather than feeling so smashed by the demands of life that it seems just all too much.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredibly powerful. I'm really curious because my personal experience, as I started to, learn more and actually check in with myself and maybe even listen and maybe even honor it, let's go nuts, was initially extreme state of overwhelm. And the way I always describe it is I feel like we have this board in our system, and it's like you're on a Zoom call with your board, and they're all giving amazing advice, but only the mind is unmuted. Your body, your emotions, depending on how woo-woo you are, your higher self or whatever external force is all on mute, and is like screaming at you, but you can't hear it. And what I'm hearing in your description of the bubbles is really tuning into all those little screens, all those Zoom rooms, and checking in what is going on there. I personally found when I started doing that, because I was so new to, feeling my feelings, whether it be physically or emotionally, that I found it quite overwhelming. I remember saying to my therapist, how does anyone get anything done? This stuffing things away and compartmentalizing worked really well. I mean, it didn't, but it felt really overwhelming. Is that something, well, first of all, am I crazy? Or is that something that happens? And how can people integrate these steps without it feeling all-encompassing?
I kind of think, again, an analogy. So I kind of think about like a pot boiling on the stove. Okay, so if you imagine a pot on the stove with the gas cranked up and the lid stuck on, eventually that lid's going to blow. Okay, if the gas remains up. So if you can kind of imagine psychosocial stresses or things that are going on in our day, that kids and work and illness or other factors, that financial stress, all the other kind of factors that we try and manage in a day, are represented by the gas, okay, and then the amount of water in the pot is, eventually kind of evaporating because it's hot. I kind of think about it like learning to let the steam off. So if I can give you tools to open the lid to let the steam off, it's not going to turn the gas down at that point necessarily, but it is going to prevent your lid blowing.
Yes.
So I think about affect regulation and distress tolerance skills, which is kind of what you're talking about, as giving you the tools to open the lid on your pot. And if you can do that, then you may also be able to establish some agency over turning the gas down. You know, what are the factors that are contributing to that gas? Do I have the people in my life for support that I need? Do I need to ask for help? Do I need to learn some more skills to be able to put my attention where it needs to be? So those kind of factors can not only let the steam off on your pot, but also can turn the heat down. And so I think it's a very normal response to think, well, I'm doing okay. If I start looking internally, what's the risk? You know, is that going to be too overwhelming?
I might not be able to put the lid back on.
Correct. And a lot of people don't necessarily want to look at emotions or be aware of their thinking, but I think we can regulate using our body to shift our mind as well. You know, there's lots of pretty cool tools. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about the physiological sigh, which is a really useful pattern of breathing to reduce the stress response.
Talk us through it. Sigh us through it.
I won't do it as well as Andrew Huberman. So, but essentially the physiological sigh is a pattern of breathing that helps to reset the fight-flight response by exhaling a huge amount of carbon dioxide quickly. So if you've got an animal, so I became interested in this because my little spoodle does this. So the double inhale and then a long exhale, what that does is inflate the little vesicles in our lungs and then deflates them very quickly. So you're expelling a huge amount of carbon dioxide in one go. And what that allows you to do is get your thinking brain back on board, turn your fight-flight response off just a little bit for a second, and that can be enough to go, okay, what do I actually need next? So that's quite useful. Movement, so anything rhythmic, repetitive and patterned. So if you think about a baby in utero, the first regulatory kind of mechanism is a mother's heartbeat, which is about around 80 beats per minute. So anything that mimics that in the same way as if someone brought a bubba in here and it was distressed, you know, we'd probably walk, pat, sing, that funny baby voice we use. So anything that mimics that 80 beats per minute is regulatory. So and that's why things like walking and swinging and colouring and, you know, mindful eating and all those things can be super helpful. You often see high performance athletes knitting or cricketers chewing gum. Yeah, those and that all those factors mimic that self-regulatory function. So I think you don't necessarily need to go deep and meaningful and reflect on your childhood. Sometimes it's just about, you know, in this moment, I'm about an 8 or 9 out of 10. I feel kind of overwhelmed. I might just get up from my desk and walk around the office or fill up my water bottle. And it's just that getting up and moving, your eyes kind of track left and right when you move forward in space. Again, that helps to regulate. So there's lots of ways of using your body to shift your mind to increase your awareness of your internal state. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go and reflect too heavily on emotion. And sometimes that's quite a good way to start rather than necessarily diving in too deep around core beliefs or which can be quite scary for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe the increased awareness of your internal state will also help you feel more confident to kind of dive in knowing that you can hold it.
For sure. Yeah.
But I think the physical aspect of it is something that is so understated. I heard this thing about, if you look at a nature documentary, and you know, what is it, like a steenbok or what is it, like some dairy kind of animal, can't for the life of me think of the name of an antelope, thank you, is being chased by a tiger or a lion and just gets away. Or a dog is almost hit by a car and just like is missed. Animals start shaking. And they literally shake the stress out of their body. We've never been taught to actually move our stress out of our body. So no wonder we're walking around in fight or flight. If we're talking about these bubbles, I think a lot of, well, especially founders are walking around maybe in that threat bubble while they should be in the drive.
For sure. And I think Well, we know that, our brain doesn't distinguish between a real alarm, so someone
Yeah.
chasing us, and a false alarm. And the coming to those kind of concepts around imposter syndrome or comparison or beliefs about not being enough, or really kind of rigid core beliefs or schemas. It's different kind of terms depending on the theoretical framework. Or intermediate beliefs, the shoulds, the if-thens, they can really trip us up if we're not aware of them. And that can drive anxiety and fear and distress and self-criticism. And self-criticism will blow up your threat response, your threat bubble, and actually take you out of drive. So paradoxically, it's taking you away from where you want to be, and nothing more than our own internal chat and monologue that is driving that. So if we can bring awareness to that, is it a thought or a fact? Is it helpful or harmful? Is it something that we want to be carrying around with, with us as an adult? If, growing up, my core belief was around, not being good enough. And so overworking and overstudying and overachieving.
I think so many can relate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't till I kind of became aware of that, and through the process of supervision, clinical supervision, but also engaging with a psychologist myself, that you learn about your beliefs and the lens through which you see the world. And if we're not aware, it's very difficult and almost impossible to regulate that.
Yeah. And so that is something that resonates deeply for me. And I think if I look at my clients and my friends, I would say that in my experience, that underlying belief of not enoughness or not lovable as is, I think, something I haven't met anyone who doesn't kind of share that on some level, not to downplay it by any means. But it's easier said than done, shift, because these beliefs, they are like these neural pathways are just like deep grooves. We have practiced this story and bought into it, and sometimes even hold on to it, because it also gives us a sense of identity and self. Because if I'm not that story anymore, then what am I? So how do you shift that?
That's a very good question. And I'll answer it with an analogy. So I kind of think about beliefs. So thinking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of a framework that is quite useful to think about thoughts. So if you imagine a tree, so at the top of the tree, I've got the beautiful branches and the trees and the leaves. And they're represented by what we call automatic thoughts. So kind of this chat, these thoughts that are there all the time, and we have a lot. And most of them aren't super helpful. We can have a negativity bias as humans, where we see what's not right instead of what is right. And that's why I quite like positive psychology, because it kind of shifts things. But at that top of the tree, you've got this cycle where you have your thoughts, and then emotions or feelings, and then physical sensations and action. So kind of like a bike chain or a treadmill going around. And so, moment to moment, that's kind of occurring. So, and it sounds a bit simplistic. We can have lots of different emotions at the same time, but the thought tends to trigger an emotion or feeling, a physical sensation, and then an urge or an action. And so that's kind of occurring all the time. And then at the grassroots is more intermediate beliefs. So they're kind of more rigid rules and assumptions, and often sound like should. So I should go to the gym. Well, I could go to the gym. If I don't go to the gym, then I'm being lazy. There's those rules and assumptions that we live by. If I leave work early, then I might be judged. If I don't get an A+ on this assignment, then I'm a failure. The kind of rules and assumptions.
Well, we make things mean about us.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. And then the roots of the tree are represented by the core beliefs, which are more rigid rules and assumptions about ourselves, about other people, and about the world in general. So there's the three kind of types of core beliefs. And they're informed by our temperament or personality, and also the kind of the experiences that we've had in life. So for people that may have had scary experiences, or lived in adversity, or not felt safe as a little person or growing up, those beliefs are going to probably be more self-protective in terms of other people can't be trusted, or the world is a bit scary. And in terms of beliefs about self, they might be I'm not lovable, or I'm not enough. And so those experiences that we have interact with our temperament or personality to shape the lens or the roots of the tree.
Right.
Now, obviously, the roots of the tree aren't visible to the naked eye, but we can make assumptions about the health or the way that the tree is living, really, from the top down. And so that's kind of how I think about where to start, and coming back to that internal mirror concept. If we stop and pause and notice just one aspect of the top of the tree, those automatic thoughts. What am I thinking? What's the story that I'm telling myself here? What am I feeling? What cues is my body giving us? Because we all have pretty good intuition in situations which we often ignore, or don't attune to, and or the action. Why am I doing what I'm doing? What's this about? Is this helpful? Is it taking me closer to where I want to be, or not? So that's kind of where I would encourage people to start. But obviously, a lot of people are living today, or human beings. There's a lot of people that are struggling and suffering, and I think it can be hard to hold hope or to know where to start. And that's why I quite like positive psychology, because irrespective of everything that's going on, we can still look for moments of joy or connection or hope and optimism. And I think that positive psychology and that strength-based approach can be quite helpful, particularly at moments of extreme kind of distress or adversity. What are my strengths and what can I lean on here? Is it grit? Is it perseverance? Is it kindness? Is it compassion? What can I use in this moment where it's really tough? And that can be quite helpful for people.
I think that's so important, and I have an unpopular question around it. I think especially in the personal development space, which is obviously, loosely based on, but definitely not as scientifically solid as actual positive psychology, but it's kind of taken out of context and thrown around quite, sometimes I feel willy-nilly. And I see a lot of potential for kind of, call it spiritual bypassing or just glossing over. I know that was something I did for a very long time in terms of just not being able or willing to hold anything that wasn't like unicorn dust and fairy tales. So how do you balance positive psychology, strength-based approach with feeling your feelings and not denying your experience?
It's a really good question, and it's not a simple kind of answer, but I suppose the way I would approach that is by acknowledge. So I use this kind of mantra with many of my clients: acknowledge, validate, respond. So acknowledge the situation. And some situations are just shit. You know, some situations are just really distressing and unfair and hard, and there's adversity or suffering, and often not through the fault of our own. And I've lived through earthquakes and the mosque shootings and fires in Australia, and lots of situations where there's people are in pretty terrible situations, and often in a chronic kind of way. So acknowledging the situation, this is a really tough situation, this is hard, and then validating the emotion. It makes sense that I feel anxious or scared or angry or jealous or whatever the emotion might be. And then the response. So given that, what do I need? What would be a helpful or an effective way to manage this situation? And that's kind of the basis of affect regulation and distress tolerance skills, is being able to acknowledge and validate. Dan Siegel talks about name it to tame it. There's lots of different kind of approaches that make it simple, but being able to acknowledge whatever the situation is for what it is, validating your own emotional response, because the emotion has a function and a purpose.
Right, that is huge. That is so important.
But I think we jump often from acknowledge to respond. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. You might be having coffee with a friend and they're really distressed or having a tough time, and they're explaining it to you, and you jump from that. Why don't you just do this? Try that. But the lack of validation, and often not intended so, but the without validating the emotion, we often don't feel seen or heard. And if we can use that kind of process for ourselves, then what that means is that we can attune to our own needs and stop invalidating our own internal state, because we often think, well, you shouldn't feel angry or don't respond that way. But actually, it makes total sense that you might feel distressed about something.
And it's there to tell you something.
Yes.
It's showing you something. Anger is a protective factor. So like learning to be like, okay, what is out of alignment that my system is responding that way?
Exactly. Yeah, if you feel angry, it's either something or a couple of factors. It might be really unfair, or there might be an obstacle in your way, and that can be quite activating. But if you think, oh, well, I shouldn't be angry, then that's probably going to escalate the anger. By labeling it and being aware of what that emotion is, you're actually more likely to be able to move through it, or for it to dissipate and be able to kind of choose an action that is probably more helpful.
Yeah, that's huge. It also, once you actually bring it to light, my experience is that it can dissipate or shrink. And
even just a tiny bit, it might be enough just to get your lid back on and to be able to decide what to do next.
Yeah. I have a question, because what I hear you say a lot in all these processes is there comes a point where we need to check in and what do I need? Ask ourselves, what do I need? And jokingly with my friends at one point, we had this thing where it's like, what does Yaela need? Because, we're not taught, not just not taught, we're almost taught the opposite, that as maybe generalizing, I'm sure it's true for humans overall, but especially for women, we are not to need, and if we do need, we don't really express it because that is selfish and that's not done. And do you find that it is hard for female founders and for women in general to connect with their needs and then to voice it? And what would you say to support them in that process?
And the answer is yes. That comes through all. And I think it's not just women. I think obviously men as well. But women, or the women that I work with, and I do a lot of work with women in different spaces, often talk about, the juggling of competing demands. And, what we saw in the COVID space was that women fared much worse in that period of time. So the literature demonstrates that women have struggled significantly in that period of COVID and post, because I think, and there's lots of factors to that, but just juggling the competing demands of work and home and school and kids and everything else that was kind of going on in that tricky time. I think, our business Grow Daily that I set up with my partner Caroline Black kind of came out of this exact need, really. So both of us shared long-standing gynecological endometriosis, pelvic pain, multiple. I think we're up to about 27 surgeries between the two of us.
Jesus.
So I think balancing those kind of needs plus babies and children and perimenopause and menopause and all the other things that no one really talks about enough, I don't think.
Until now
is tough. And so when we look at women or girls and women, females, we know that around the adolescent period there's a significant increase in anxiety and mood disorders for girls compared to boys, and then through puberty and adolescence there's lots of significant changes neurobiologically that occur, then coming into kind of childbearing age and birth and the processes that occur postnatally, and there's a lot of neuroscience around it, but not anywhere enough is what there needs to be. And in this conference that I just attended in Boston, there was a lot of conversations around somatic symptoms and anxiety and trauma, and there's some very cool research that's being completed by Stanford and Harvard around pelvic pain and this concept of visceral inflammation, whereby there might be gynecological issues that then create inflammation in surrounding tissue or other organs, and then you end up with irritable bowel and other kind of symptomology that might not be able to be explained necessarily from the medical profession,
Yeah.
but is creating a lot of somatic symptomology that then exacerbates anxiety and mood. And so you kind of see this, all these symptoms that are presenting that we just are kind of hidden, and we tend to internalize because no one really knows what to do about them.
Yeah.
And then
that's just part of the deal.
That's right. Just suck it up. And that's, what I was told for a long time. The endometriosis, it doesn't exist. It's in your head, But like many doctors. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
And it's horrific. And so these models that are coming out now around the link between mind and body is so incredibly important. And so at Grow Daily, our central kind of goal in life really is to support women to understand themselves and to be able to figure out what they need and how to take a step, even in the world of complete chaos and busyness, to be able to acknowledge and validate their own internal state. I think it's so incredibly important above anything else. And if we as women can collectively do that, and have an awareness, normalize it, and check in with your friends' internal state, internal mirror. Then I think we begin to have those conversations, and that's where trust builds and relational engagement builds, and that's the power of connection, really.
Yeah. So that actually that joke of like asking what does Yaela need was actually not, it was actually fucking spot on.
100%.
Because it forces you to be like, actually, what do I need right now? And gives a permission slip, which we don't actually need to ask for it. So, I mean, everyone, ask your friends, what do they need? And ask yourselves. One last question, maybe two more. But I've heard you bring up a couple of times in this conversation, compassion. Traditionally, when I hear peak performance and compassion, they seem like different realms. Tell me about compassion. Why is this so important?
So this is, again, something that I've kind of learnt over time. So my tendency probably is to be self-critical, and in part, that's the function of that is probably to strive and to get better. But paradoxically, that critical kind of internal chat can activate that threat response and actually take us offline. And so I had a moment when I became interested in psychology when I was 16. So my dad did the John Kehoe course when I was 15 or 16. So John Kehoe is not the founder of positive psychology. He's not really positive psychology. He's more kind of visualization and metaphysics and things, but interesting. And the power of thought, and that, thinking is important in terms of changing the way you feel, and all kind of similar to CBT, but slightly different. Anyway, my dad did this course, and I noticed that over the course of the 6 to 8 weeks that his way of responding to things was different.
That drastically. At 16, you noticed that.
And so I said to him, if John Kehoe ever comes back, can I please attend that course? And mum and dad both said yes, of course. And so I was in sixth form, so 16, 17, trotted along to the town hall in Christchurch in my uniform for 6 to 8 weeks and attended this course. And I learnt that a thought isn't a fact, that you don't have to accept the chat in your head as reality, that you can diffuse from and unstick from thoughts and feelings, and therefore you can have agency and autonomy over self. And in that process, I learnt that we can actually the words and the language that we use has a significant impact on our self. And so self-criticism and being very rigid in the way we think and holding ourselves to unrelenting standards that are silly and are meaningless and that we wouldn't hold for anybody else.
No, and also
makes
are impossible, because it's usually an ever-moving goalpost.
Yes, absolutely. So I suppose I learned a little bit of flexibility in that, and then over the course of study and working with people, I probably realised that self-criticism, I can't just espouse this to other people. I've got to walk this, and that's where I became interested in the neurobiology of compassion and self-compassion, and that the more critical we are, the more it activates our threat response, and so that the kryptonite of that is self-compassion, and that's where the acknowledge, validate, respond kind of comes from, that softening our internal dialogue, or just being a little bit less demanding on self, or seeing things. And there's lots of ways of doing that from psychological approaches, but how would you speak to a friend, or is there a reframe, is there a way to soften the words, should versus could, those kind of strategies we were talking about before. I get to rather than I have to. All those little tips just allow us to maybe be more present and less demanding of self, which allows us to perform better. We can't perform if our lid is about to flip. It's just whether we're parenting, or whether we're running a marathon, or whether we're on the sports field, or whatever it might be, that we can't perform when our arousal's too high. We need to bring it back a bit. And so in order to perform, again, acknowledging, validating internal state, but being able to soften the chat in our head to a more compassionate response is much more effective. And that's something that a lot of sports psychologists use in the same level. If we're holding ourselves to the unrelenting standards and we have a fear of not getting gold, or not getting the kick, or whatever it might be, then
that will happen
100%. Yeah.
One of the most and I don't know if this is a sound and will fly by your standards, but the quickest way I have ever shifted that internal, I call her my internal bitch, like the language I used in my internal monologue or dialogue, or sometimes there were a lot of people there, was quite jarring. And one of my yoga teachers once told me, he's like, okay, next time you catch yourself, I want you to picture, in my case, it's my daughter, picture her standing in front of you, say it out loud. Like you get a visceral response, like the way I spoke to myself, imagining that innocent, beautiful little girl and having to say it out loud, that shifted it really quickly.
For sure.
Yeah. But what I'm hearing you say is that that there's a neurobiological effect as well. So it's not just, woo woo, I'm
That's correct.
Yeah, it changes the actual biology of how your brain is working.
So there's a lot of functional MRI imaging work that happens. In fact, in the States, they're doing a huge amount of this work. But from a self-compassionate perspective, when you're activating your default mode network, which is where we go when our mind is kind of just wandering, it's never very good. And so by activating or utilizing more compassionate response, or being aware of internal state, it allows us to get our thinking brain online, and then we're able to reflect and be more intentional. So yes, 100% from a neurobiological perspective, being compassionate is not just a soft, kind, it's way more than kindness. It's actually an intentional stance to take. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, now it's really the last one, I promise. If you were forced to only stick to one practice to live the best version of your life, which one would stay?
One practice in terms of? In terms of
regulation, self-compassion, and therefore peak performance, everything you're about.
One practice. It would have to be connection. Like I'd have to be being present with people. Amazing. So being where your feet are, essentially. But the capacity to bring your attention to the present moment with others, but also with self, and again, that kind of comes back to that ability to be aware and self-regulate. All of the executive functions require our presence to be with self and to be with other people. So I think that probably would be the one thing
that stays. So does this mean that everyone listening needs to go and seek professional help in order to reach the state of like homeostasis and perform optimally?
No. So I mean,
I'm putting you out of business. Sorry.
I think everyone should have a psychologist, but in the world that we live in, we're significantly short in the area of psychologists and mental health professionals. So I suppose what my intention is as a psychologist is that I've had the privilege of pretty amazing education and the ability to work with lots and lots of different people. And I think it's incredibly important to generalize tools and make them accessible, and knowledge. And there's a lot of knowledge and skills available out there, but it's like, I think if you Google, diets, you get about 4 billion hits back, and it's very difficult to filter out the information. And so what my intention is, whether it's in the field of, working with lawyers, or whether it's working with mums, or whether it's working with women, or with athletes, this is my need, and where do I go to access information or knowledge, and empirically based, not just woo-woo, this sounds like a good idea. So it's really, that's, really important to me. And so, at Grow Daily and the other work that I do around MediMinds, which is a gut-brain disorder
oh my God, that's a whole
program.
different podcast.
God. But what we're trying to do is equip people with the knowledge and skills that we have very quickly and in a really digestible way that doesn't overwhelm them. And so there's lots, as I say, there's amazing tools out there. Andrew Huberman does all this Instagram, and there's amazing knowledge and skills. There's lots and lots of different people out there that are doing this, and it's trying to figure out, how do I know where to go, and how do I equip myself? If I just want to start with one thing, what do I do? And so I think what I'm trying to do is centralize that kind of information and make it available to people through this kind of process, really, because I think, as I say, mental health needs are at an all-time high, and services are at an all-time low, really, in terms of the demands that run availability. So, so I probably feel quite passionate about encouraging people to take a step. It doesn't have to be, the step, just kind of looking into something, or doing a physiological sigh, or setting a 30-second micro step each day. All of those little tiny steps will create change.
Amazing. So we will put all of this in the show notes as well, but where can people find you and Grow Daily if they were to look?
So we have a website, Grow Daily website, and I have another couple of arms of the things that we do. So we do a lot of work in the space of ADHD, and not just assessment, but more, what and why, but how do we
need
kind of
another
address
episode on that.
And then my brother Nick Anticich and he's a gastroenterologist, have developed a program called MediMinds, which is for disorders of gut-brain interaction. And the purpose of that really was because that exactly what I was talking about before, in terms of medical or somatic symptoms and psychological interaction, and the need out there in terms of we just don't have enough doctors and psychologists. So we let's do this together. So we created a shared medical appointment model.
Amazing.
Yeah. So there's lots of, but both of our websites have links and available tools to amazing other people that provide these services as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Go check them out. This was amazing. Oh, I love this so much. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.